It's really a shame what happened to the Sega Saturn.
What's the hottest 16-bit video game system with true arcade games?
Sega used to be a giant of the industry. Throughout the late 80s and early 90s, they had an active Western fanbase thanks to the Mega Drive, aka Genesis, which was Nintendo's first real competition in the Western market since Atari crashed out in 1983. And while Sega's consoles could never really square up with Nintendo's over in Japan, the still very popular arcade scene in the region kept Sega relevant nonetheless. The relationship between Nintendo and Sega in the 90s is often described as adversarial, but in truth, they were really more complementary. Nintendo may have dominated living rooms, but Sega ruled domain over the arcades. From that perspective, a lot of the decisions Sega of Japan would make with the Saturn made some sense. Sega arcade machines were popular, so why not make a home console that could, at least mostly, replicate their arcade output? Sega had already gone to the trouble of creating the Virtua processor chip for Mega Drive games, designed to allow true 3D polygons on the 16-bit console. But ultimately, only a single Mega Drive title would actually use said processing chip, Virtua Racing. With the Saturn, Sega could build a home console from the ground up that was capable of running arcade-quality games. And just to drive this point home, their arcade dev teams were pulled into their console division to help ensure the Saturn would receive top-notch titles. At one point, they even considered launching two separate Saturn models, one that ran on CD-ROMs, and a cheaper one that would use cartridges instead. Eventually, only the disc version would see the light of day, as Sega noticed that cartridges were growing increasingly outdated, and were still far more expensive to produce than CDs. But while Sega of Japan was proud of the work they were doing on the Saturn, Sega of America had much different thoughts. The American branch had just had major success with their version of the Sega Mega Drive, the Genesis, and they apparently weren't too keen on a lot of the Saturn's proposed specs. Early on, Sega of America president Tom Kalinske proposed a collaboration with Silicon Graphics, but Sega of Japan refused, and Silicon Graphics would ultimately partner with Nintendo instead to create the N64. Kalinske then pitched a deal with Sony, but Sega of Japan again turned this down. Sega wanted the Saturn to be a joint 2D-3D console, and Sony was much more focused on purely 3D games. Whether it was from passion or plain old stubbornness, Sega of Japan was determined to stick to their ideal vision of the Saturn, regardless of what their peers had to say about it. But make no mistake, the Saturn was genuinely impressive for its time. It had a fantastic 2D graphics chip that produced some of the most advanced sprite effects yet seen, and it was also capable of rendering 3D polygons. However, as the PlayStation loomed ever closer on the horizon, Sega began to get cold feet about their console's competing 3D capabilities. And just as work on the Saturn was basically finished, Sega made the last-minute decision to design an additional CPU for the machine that could render stronger 3D effects. While this could produce some very impressive results, it was also very complex, making it difficult for a lot of devs to utilize the hardware to its full potential. The Saturn's twin CPUs couldn't access the system memory simultaneously, affecting the machine's ability to maintain steady performance. In a way, Sega had designed the Saturn twice, duct-taping two consoles together into one. There had been tension between the American and Japanese divisions of Sega for years at this point, and after the Saturn was announced in 1994, with almost none of the input from the Americans taken into account, Sega of America would release their own 32-bit add-on for the Genesis instead, the Sega 32X. The 32X had similar architecture to the Saturn, but was cheaper and ran on Genesis hardware, and so could be marketed as a low-price alternative. Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama had approved development of the 32X because he believed it would keep the upcoming Atari Jaguar at bay while work was being finished on the Saturn. On November 22, 1994, the Saturn was released in Japan, and on the very same day in America, the 32X would launch at half the Saturn's price. But the 32X would completely flop, and in addition to causing further tension between the rivaling Sega branches, the near-simultaneous launch of two different 32-bit Sega consoles would cause a lot of confusion and frustration among consumers, and as a result many of them would look elsewhere, namely to Sony's new PlayStation. Around this time, almost as if accepting defeat, Tom Kalinske would change his tune on the Saturn, saying that its dual processors were necessary to bring true arcade experiences to a home console. But while 32X sales basically took a complete nosedive once Christmas was over, the Saturn, all things considered, actually did pretty alright for a while. Sega's initial shipment of 200,000 Saturn units sold out on the first day, no doubt thanks to Virtua Fighter being a launch title, as the popular arcade fighting game sold almost as many copies as the console itself did. Sega would decide to wait until the release of the PlayStation to ship out more Saturns, hoping that the competition would eat into Sony's initial sales numbers. And when the two consoles were finally pitted head-to-head, the Saturn did prove more popular for the first few months, reaching 1 million units sold before June 1995. It was at this point, however, that Sony started to gradually overtake Sega. PlayStation was easier to program for, and its games were slightly cheaper and faster to make, attracting several third-party devs when compared to the Saturn. At the first E3 in 1995, Sega announced the surprise same-day launch of the Saturn in North America, months ahead of its planned holiday release window. This was mandated by Sega of Japan as an aggressive attempt to one-up Sony in the Western market, a decision that reportedly even caught Tom Kalinske by surprise. 30,000 Saturn units had already been shipped out to select retailers, available for public purchase later that day. But then, at that very same E3 conference, Sony would follow Sega's announcement with their own PlayStation showcase. And we all know how that went.
$299.
Sony's stunt completely stole the thunder from Sega. The so-called price heard round the world was at the center of discussion in the worlds of tech and video games, and it often seemed like the Saturn wasn't even part of the discussion anymore. Sega's gamble had not paid off. In fact, it had horribly backfired. Certain retailers that had been excluded from the Saturn's shadow drop, including some major outlets like Best Buy and Walmart, were upset about missing out on potential sales. Thus, they would refuse to sell the Saturn at all as an act of protest. All 6 of the US Saturn launch titles were first-party Sega titles, since third-party devs had all mapped out their deadlines based on the original holiday release window, and this no doubt sowed some frustration towards Sega amongst the publishers as well. As a result, the Saturn saw basically no benefits from their head start over Sony, since the console would receive almost no additional titles between its launch in June and the PlayStation's US launch the following September. There's good reason that E3 conference is sometimes referred to, perhaps a bit melodramatically, as the day Sega died. More unfortunate for Sega, Sony would also manage to one-up the Saturn on its 2 biggest selling points: fighting games and high-quality arcade ports. The PlayStation received a very impressive port of Namco arcade title Ridge Racer, whereas Sega's home port of Daytona USA was seen as fairly shoddy. Namco had also released a nearly arcade-perfect port of Tekken on the PlayStation, which went on to be the console's first million seller. Sega, frankly, began to panic. They announced a price drop for the Saturn in October, from $399 to $299, matching the PlayStation's famous launch price, and would also begin a fairly aggressive ad campaign. Their commercials would skew more towards adults, something Sony was also doing, and Sega would of course continue to deploy the tactic that had worked so well for them against Nintendo: good old-fashioned trash talk. Sega quickly switched from picking on Nintendo in their ads to picking on Sony, calling the rival console the plaything, and mocking Sony's early and overly obtuse "you are not ready" ads with the claim "you are not worthy." Seriously, the PlayStation ads, it was a letter E, but it was red, and we were supposed to read that as a red E, ready, you are not ready. It was weird. Early Sony was weird. Frankly, those Sega ads are both depressing and hilarious in hindsight. While Virtua Cop and Virtua Fighter continued to be big draws for Sega, and although the two consoles were selling in almost even numbers come early 1996, Sega would ultimately fail to reverse Sony's lead. There's also the fact that the Saturn's profit margins were much smaller than the PlayStation's. Sega had eventually dropped the price to $199 to keep up with the PlayStation's price drops, even though the Saturn was much more expensive to produce. Throughout 1995, older Sega Genesis games continued to sell higher than Saturn products by a rate of 64%, something Sega of Japan hadn't anticipated. Hayao Nakayama had seen the relative success of Saturn in Japan, and thus put all the company's focus on the new console, and made the miscalculation that American sales would be comparable.
We are 5 years away from entering the 21st century.
With all the baffling decisions Sega made around this time, the 32X, the convoluted Saturn architecture, the poor planning, the short-sighted surprise release date, it's easy to maybe point fingers at the troubled Saturn development as the reason for Sega's eventual downfall. But the Saturn was really more of a byproduct of the company's other stumbles. Sega had been taking risks for years now. In fact, that sort of devil-may-care attitude was effectively part of their public image and branding back then, and the company's interdepartmental relations had been fractured for quite some time. But Sega wasn't going to go down without a fight, and the Saturn still had its fair share of defenders. Even if the Saturn was slower and more convoluted, and even if the console lacked any simple-to-use dev kits in its first year or so, it was considered a very impressive machine for very experienced and talented coders, and had more raw calculating power than the PlayStation. While the Saturn's 3D rendering capabilities were questionable, it uses 4-sided polygons as opposed to the standard 3-sided ones, it was generally agreed that the Saturn's 2D processor was leaps and bounds ahead of the competition, to the point where it could use 2D sprites to effectively simulate full 3D. An inverse to the PlayStation, which had impressive 3D capabilities but struggled to elegantly portray traditional 2D sprites. Where the PlayStation was built specifically for 3D, the Saturn was a state-of-the-art 2D machine that perhaps wasn't fully optimized for 3D, but could still produce impressive 3D when it needed to. Early reception to the Saturn was fairly optimistic, being cited as a more advanced machine than Sony's offerings, and some said it had the potential to shape the future of the industry. While the Saturn gained a reputation for being complicated to program for, some third-party devs came out publicly to dispute this belief. Then CEO of Treasure, Masato Maegawa, went on record saying that he found the N64 to be the most difficult of the 5th-generation consoles. Traveler's Tales founder John Burton had similar thoughts, saying that while PlayStation was easier to wrap your head around, its limitations were far more strict, whereas the Saturn was capable of far more impressive feats when you managed to use it correctly. By the end of 1995, though, opinions started to shift, mainly in response to the Saturn's lack of substantial releases when compared to the PlayStation. Much of the Saturn's early library consisted of ports of the company's popular arcade titles: Daytona USA, SEGA Rally Championship, Virtua Cop, Virtua Fighter, etc. This is a partial explanation for why the console continued to perform well in Japan, where arcades were still a popular mainstream pastime. The Saturn's big issue when compared to its competitors, though, is that it seemed to lack many truly original exclusive games. The only really notable title launched within the console's first year that wasn't an arcade port was Panzer Dragoon, an on-rails shooter that was largely critically acclaimed, but which also could be finished in less than 3 hours. The console also lacked a good mascot platformer, a genre of game that was seen as much more necessary to industry branding back then. The Saturn didn't launch with any Sonic games, and instead released a platformer titled Bug within its first year. The game starred a character that some thought could become a public face for the Saturn. However, despite eventually receiving a sequel, the game failed to take off in the way some maybe hoped. So instead, in early 1996, eyes were tuned to an upcoming title from Sonic Team, now largely reformed and back in Japan. They were currently developing a platformer featuring not Sonic, but instead completely brand new characters and concepts. Hopes were high. After all, if any first-party Sega dev team was capable of making a console-selling video game, it was Sonic Team. Inspired by Yuji Naka's constant business flights between San Fran and Tokyo, the team was at work building a game that revolved around full, free 360-degree flight, and many fans waited with bated breath for the then well-beloved dev team's newest masterpiece, wondering amongst themselves, how does one make a platformer without platforms? Throughout the 16-bit era, Sonic the Hedgehog was Sega's pride and joy. He was the character that finally put Sega on the map and made them a worthy competitor to Nintendo. Internally, though, Sonic Team programmer Yuji Naka grew somewhat fatigued with creating the various Sonic sequels. As far back as Sonic 2, he was already expressing his desire to work on new game ideas. And after the release of Sonic & Knuckles in 1994, Naka and his longtime colleague, Naoto Oshima, departed Sega Technical Institute and returned to Sega of Japan. There, they would begin work on games for the SEGA Saturn, eventually settling on a game that revolved around flying. After working on Sonic games for so long, Naka and Oshima had two main desires with this new game. They wanted it to star a human-like character, and they wanted it to have stronger thematic center than Sonic did. The themes they would settle on would be to explore the human subconsciousness through the world of dreams. Nights into Dreams stars a pair of children, a young boy named Elliot Edwards and a young girl named Clarice Sinclair, who, in their dreams, meet and become one with a mysterious but friendly imp-like character known as NiGHTS. The world of dreams is formed by the power of dream energy, which comes in several varieties: white representing purity, green representing wisdom, yellow representing hope, and blue representing intelligence. Elliot and Claris both possess the rarest and most valuable of dream energy, red representing bravery. As such, NiGHTS seeks the children's aid in thwarting the plans of Wise Man the Wicked, who, with his army of evil Knight Marin, plans to capture the world's dream energy in an attempt to leave the subconscious world and conquer the physical one. Wise Man is sending his strongest Knight Marin to capture the red dream energy from Elliot and Claris. With the kids' help, NiGHTS just may be able to save both worlds, and with help from NiGHTS, perhaps Elliot and Claris will find the strength within themselves to overcome their own troubles back home. NiGHTS has famously been described as a 2.5D platformer without the platforms. 2.5D is a term that would pop up a lot throughout the early 3D era of gaming, used to describe games that use 3D assets but play largely in 2D. NiGHTS definitely fits that description, with most of the graphical assets and level layouts being full 3D, but the bulk of the gameplay is a side-scroller. The game's lead designer, Takashi Iizuka, said that this was the most difficult aspect of creating the game, as making a 3D side-scroller felt contradictory. But Yuji Naka stuck with the decision to keep the game largely on rails, as he felt the game became too complicated when played in full 3D. Each of the two playable characters has 3 unique levels called Dreams to play through, with Elliot's selection being generally more difficult. Both kids have a shared final dream, making a total of 8, though functionally 7, stages. In each level, the chosen kid must join up with NiGHTS, quite literally, and then fly around the stage gathering chips floating throughout the skies. At a minimum of 20 chips, they're able to then seek out and retrieve the stolen dream energy from one of Wiseman's various idea captures, and return it to the Idea Palace where they started. This is repeated 4 times per stage, with each lap around the stage following a pre-scripted 2D path, each of increasing length and complexity, as they retrieve each of the 4 colors of stolen dream energy. At the end of the 4th lap, or round, the player is taken to a boss stage where they'll have to fight off one of Wiseman's henchmen. While that's all that's required of the player to finish the game, NiGHTS Into Dreams is actually an arcade-style score-building game. Each round grants you a ranking based on your score, which are all then averaged out at the end of each dream. A score multiplier is also factored in, ranging from 1x to 2x, depending on how quickly the boss is defeated. Whenever you break open an idea capture, you're granted a double score multiplier until you return the dream energy to the palace. So while you only have to play each lap 1 time, or however many it takes you to get the minimum 20 chips required, if you want high rankings, you're actually expected to bypass returning to the palace, and instead repeat each lap over and over, chaining combos of chips, stars, hoops, and tricks together to build your score. Each pass through the palace sets you a countdown timer of 120 seconds, and you're meant to manage that time as best as you can to get as many points as possible before time runs out. Should you run out of time, Elliot or Claris will be separated from NiGHTS' body, losing all the chips and score they've currently collected, and will have to navigate the full 3D level on foot to return to the palace and reunite with NiGHTS. If they've already collected the dream energy, the round ends with no score gained, and the next lap begins. If Elliot or Claris is too slow to reunite with NiGHTS at the palace, they'll begin to be chased by an alarm clock, and should it catch them, they'll wake up, ending the level and granting a game over. A minimum C rank is required to clear each dream, and so if the player runs out of time for too many rounds, they'll fail the level and have to try again from scratch. When in NiGHTS' form, the player's method of traversal is via full omnidirectional flight, albeit on a 2D plane, although there are some brief behind-the-back segments as well. NiGHTS has a gauge at the bottom of the screen that fills whenever the player passes through hoops throughout each level, and this gauge allows NiGHTS to perform a drill move that serves as both a speed boost and method of attack, although it hinders their turn radius. If NiGHTS flies in a complete circle, they'll perform a paraloop, collecting any item or defeating any enemy that's within said circle. Occasionally, NiGHTS will pass through special trick hoops, which allow the player a short time to freestyle a variety of tricks using a combination of shoulder buttons and directional inputs, which will grant them additional points. NiGHTS notably has no health gauge. Instead, whenever NiGHTS takes damage, 5 seconds is deducted from the player's remaining time. And so the game really becomes about balancing your time limit with the length of each round as efficiently as possible to gain as many points as possible. And once you've cleared a dream once, repeat plays will shuffle each level's bosses around, adding an element of randomness to the game. Thing is though, you're not told any of that. For a game that takes pride in being a never-before-seen concept full of unique and creative new gameplay ideas, NiGHTS Into Dreams makes absolutely no attempt to tell you how to play. In fact, quite the opposite, it immediately puts you at risk of a game over. See, while you're meant to play as knights, you start off each level playing as one of the children. When you're playing as Elliot or Claris, the level is full 3D. The game places knights right in front of you and denotes your goal with an arrow, but a new player might be under the impression that the level is meant to be played like this. While I'm fairly sure you can still collect chips and even retrieve dream energy from the idea captures when playing as the kids, you're not scored for any of it, and you're also being chased by the alarm clock that can give you a game over. Once you do join with knights, the level is at least limited to a side-scroller to make it simpler, but the game still doesn't tell you what you're supposed to do. It doesn't tell you what the idea captures are, how to open them, what each collectible does, or that you can postpone each round to gain additional score. The game doesn't even show you the intro cutscenes for each character when you start their game. You have to wait on the title screen and let the attract mode play. Now, this game was released at a time where reading the manual for a video game to get story and gameplay details was still somewhat normalized, but I can think of very few video games where the manual felt like required reading like it does here. And even if you do read the manual, the game's different power-up items are nowhere to be found in it. I had to go to a wiki to find out what they did. Apparently they're called power panels, by the way. Despite first impressions, though, once you really get into the swing of things, Nights into Dreams can be pretty darn fun. It's simple, for one thing. Aside from trick rings, the entire game can be played with one button. That trademark Yuji Naka game design mentality that worked so well for Sonic the Hedgehog, and so disastrously for Balan Wonderworld. Nights is a very arcade-style game, where the goal is to rack up as high a score as possible within relatively bite-sized levels. And as I spent more time with the game, I became increasingly obsessed with keeping my combos going. Once you've activated the double score multiplier, doing each lap twice will usually be enough to get an A rank, but the time limit typically gives you time for several more, and that's to really encourage the sort of score attack mentality you see in traditional arcade cabinets. Nights' free flight is incredibly smooth and elegant, and Sonic Team actually designed an entirely new controller specifically for Nights' circular movement. The standard Saturn controller was very much an evolution of the 6-button Genesis controller. The general shape and layout is almost exactly the same, with the only new addition being the shoulder buttons. This was definitely done to complement the arcade-heavy library of the early Saturn days, and was built under the assumption that most Saturn games would be 2D. For what it is, it's a great controller. In fact, within the fighting game community, the Saturn controller is typically seen as the best controller to use for 2D fighters. With Nights, though, the team realized that while the standard D-pad worked just fine, it wasn't ideal, and so they started brainstorming alternate controller ideas. Apparently, over 100 concepts were pitched, including a hands-free controller that the player used with their feet, and a Nights-shaped doll that the player could move around to dictate the character's direction. What they eventually settled on, though, was the Saturn Circle Pad, which extends the standard design of the Saturn controller into a larger circle shape, with a not-quite joystick, not-quite trackball located in the upper left. During development, Steven Spielberg visited the Sonic Team offices and became the first person outside the company to use the controller, causing the team to henceforth refer to it as the Spielberg as an inside joke. To the team's credit, the Spielberg feels very smooth, and the controller is a lot more comfortable to hold than it may look. Strangely, though, it seems that the Spielberg does not actually have true 360-degree movement range, and instead is just mapping the D-pad to the circle pad. I theorize this because the Spielberg requires you to toggle between one or the other, which leads me to believe that it literally can't map directional input to both at once. While Nights can be played with a standard D-pad just fine, it is probably worth hunting down one of these circle pads to get the full experience. It'll certainly make things much smoother while you work on getting those A ranks. And if you get A ranks on every level, both characters' standard endings are swapped out with an extended true ending, complete with an alternative version of the end credits music. And man, the music in Nights almost makes the whole thing worth it on its own. Once you get past the completely silent title screen, that's a choice, the music takes off and doesn't slow down. Nights takes after Sonic CD in that every level has 4 different music arrangements, but this game takes that idea and expands on it in a really interesting way. Scattered throughout each level are various NiGHTOpians, the inhabitants of Nights' dream world, and they act as a kind of virtual pet mechanic. Think of them as precursors to the Chow from Sonic Adventure. Elliot, Claris, and Nights can interact with the NiGHTOpians in various ways that will affect the NiGHTOpians' mood. They may follow you around, they may smile when they see you, and if 2 NiGHTOpians get together, they may lay an egg. If you hatch that egg, the NiGHTOpians' opinion of you will improve. You can even accidentally kill NiGHTOpians if you get them caught in a paraloop, and this will obviously upset them. If you manage to knock a Nightmarean into a Nightopian, they'll merge to form a hybrid known as a Meepian. And believe it or not, this all plays into the level's music. Depending on the Nightopian's mood, how they feel about you, and how many there are in the level, each phrase of the level's music will change to reflect that. While there are 4 full arrangements of each level theme, the music won't stick to just one. It will change in real time to reflect the mood of the Nightopians in each section of the level. The music can start in the normal arrangement for one phrase, and then change to the happy or angry arrangements for the next. This essentially means that every time you play each level, the music will sound completely different. This is frankly one of the most creative and ambitious ways I've ever seen a video game present its soundtrack. Sure, games like Ocarina of Time would later have some context-sensitive music, with Hyrule Field's theme dynamically changing to reflect whether the player was standing still, walking, running, or in battle, but something about NiGHTS' approach somehow feels more personal. No two players will ever have the exact same music arrangement on the same level. Frankly, Super Mario 64's soundtrack should be ashamed of itself. Oh, you're just gonna play the Bob on Battlefield music again. That's cute. NiGHTS' morphing soundtrack creates its own intrinsic sense of replay value even outside of getting A ranks, which was one of the dev team's goals. They wanted to make a game that was simple enough for young children and casual players, but with enough depth and variation to keep experienced ones coming back again and again. That sort of creativity permeates through every aspect of NiGHTS' gameplay and art design. I've already talked about how unique the gameplay and music is, but the game's visual design definitely didn't get the short end of the stick here. In creating a world based on dreams, Sonic Team, particularly Takashi Iizuka, didn't want to just make a world of pure fantasy elements, but rather a more grounded world based in psychology and dream theory. Elliot, Claris, and NiGHTS were based on the theories of animus, anima, and shadow by psychoanalyst Carl Jung, and the game also pulls elements from the ideas of Sigmund Freud and Friedrich Holtz. The game's use of CGI cutscenes over hand-animated ones was a choice made to give the game a dreamlike quality throughout, and to further blur the lines between the dream world and the real one. NiGHTS as a character was inspired by Cirque du Soleil performances, and designed to have as wide an appeal as possible, with a look that is culturally ambiguous and overall mysterious. The character looks a little scary, but also friendly, and it can take various forms throughout the levels, such as a dolphin or a bobsled. The design on its own is honestly really appealing. After Sonic the Hedgehog, Naoto Oshima once again proves that, if nothing else, he knows how to make appealing characters. NiGHTS' personality reflects that of whichever child it's joined with, which the team felt gave the character more depth than Sonic, who was seen as rather two-dimensional by comparison. Since NiGHTS resides in the world of dreams, the dev team even posited that they'd created a character that players could actually meet in their real life. NiGHTS is also androgynous, being neither male nor female, as it's meant to represent the dream version of all of us. Truly a non-binary icon. I'm telling you, if Tumblr had existed back in 1996, NiGHTS would be right up there with Jack Skellington as one of the original Tumblr sexy men, and no doubt would be the profile picture of millions of online lesbians today. NiGHTS Into Dreams is also a technical wonder for its day, with 3D capabilities that a lot of people at the time didn't even think was possible on the Saturn. It's an absolutely beautiful game that really showed what the console can do in the right hands, and so it might come as a surprise that Yuji Naka originally wanted the game to use 2D sprites. He had to be convinced that 3D polygons were capable of expressive and fluid movement before changing his mind. The game even has native 16:9 widescreen support, which was a pleasant surprise. I had to look this up, only like 4 Saturn games did this. This was not at all common back then. The game also makes great use of true stereo audio. The first time I played this game years ago, this laugh during one of the opening cutscenes made me jump because it quite literally sounded like it was in the room with me. Obviously, that's all going to depend on your specific audio setup, but on my TV, it literally sounded like it was in my ear. It was insane. The FMVs do suffer from some pretty bad compression, though, since the team apparently underestimated how much disk space video files would take. but this also meant that they didn't need to resort to making the game 2 discs like they at one point considered. If there's any honest criticism I can throw at NiGHTS, it's that the game is too easy and too short. The game has a total of 7 levels that can all be finished in less than 5 minutes, making minimum playtimes easily less than an hour. Granted, this could be said of many Sonic Team games from this point in time, but with the leap to 3D, a lot of us expected average playtimes to increase across the board. The game is also lacking in bonus content or alternate play modes. There's a 2-player versus mode where players take the role of Knights and Riala, basically Knights' version of Metal Sonic, as they try to land 3 hits on each other before time runs out. The player can also toggle which bosses they want to show up at the end of each level instead of just leaving it on random. But other than that, it's just the base 7 levels and not much else. At one point, a time attack mode was going to be implemented, and while the team found it fun, they noticed that this would only encourage players to fly in a straight line the whole time, which they felt detracted from the game's intended spirit, where elegant, beautiful flight was the goal. So with the lack of any bonus modes, this game is really riding on the hope that you'll be incentivized enough to replay the game for A ranks. The 3D camera when playing as the kids is also pretty awful, being too low to the ground and only turning in fixed increments, but seeing as you're not supposed to play as the kids most of the time anyway, I'm not gonna really hold that against the game. Nonetheless, NiGHTS Into Dreams became an instant classic, and the most popular game on the SEGA Saturn. It topped the sales charts in Japan, despite being released just a month after the Nintendo 64. Reviews were glowing, scoring in the high 80s and low 90s, with the free flight mechanic and analog controller both being widely praised, as well as its lush, fluid art design, dynamic soundtrack, and unique gameplay. The game's graphics were lauded for being almost too advanced for the Saturn, resulting in some clipping and flickering issues, but nonetheless described as the best 3D graphics yet seen on any console. Its short length and largely side-scrolling nature did see some pushback in the wake of Super Mario 64, but the overall appeal of the package seemed to make up for it, particularly the music, which one outlet described as the best video game music of all time. Yuji Naka's NiGHTS engine is also considered one of the most impressive and ambitious on the SEGA Saturn. The game was seen as a perfect evolution from Sonic, and won several awards that year, such as Best Graphics and Best Programming, and the Circle Pad even won Best Peripheral. The game has gone on to become a staple of Sonic Team, with NiGHTS making cameo appearances in various other SEGA and Sonic Team games, and Yuji Naka has said that he considers the release of NiGHTS to be when Sonic Team was truly established as a brand. A PC port was reportedly completed but never released, and a sequel titled Air NiGHTS was planned and even officially announced at one point, eventually being pushed to the Dreamcast, but was ultimately cancelled. Yuji Naka would then speak on his belief that NiGHTS didn't need a sequel, describing the game as his personal E.T., in the sense that it was a product he felt was perfect the way it was, and that a sequel or remake would only risk tainting it. NiGHTS as a character, however, would go on to become a vehicle for building Sega's brand, alongside other mascots like Sonic. And while no NiGHTS sequel would ever be released on a Sega console, we would eventually see one released for the Wii in 2007, a year after Yuji Naka officially left Sega, which is almost definitely not a coincidence. As for my thoughts, I kinda adore this game. While it may not have the fully 3D environmental exploration of Super Mario 64, NiGHTS' emphasis on graceful movement was another way of showcasing the intuitive nature of analog movement in video games. It represented the end of one era at Sonic Team and the beginning of another. This was the last Sega project to feature Yuji Naka as lead programmer, and the first to feature Takashi Iizuka as lead game designer. There's a real passion and artistry to the game that oozes out of its every pore, and looking back, in light of how many games in the coming years would just try to blatantly copy Mario 64, it's honestly just really nice to have a 5th-gen mascot platformer that feels truly unique. Of the 3 big competing mascot platformers that released in 1996, NiGHTS is the one that feels the most fresh. Mario 64 may have completely reinvented the Mario formula, but it was still Mario. We knew who Mario was, we knew what his whole deal was. Meanwhile, Crash Bandicoot was one of the most shamelessly derivative games I've ever seen. A bizarre amalgamation of Sonic the Hedgehog, Looney Tunes, and Donkey Kong Country that feels like it doesn't have a single original bone in its body. And sure, Mario and Crash may have been the bigger games in terms of popularity, but if you ask me, NiGHTS was the best mascot platformer of 1996. At the very least, it was certainly the most creative. While the release of NiGHTS briefly breathed new life into the Saturn audience, the console would ultimately fail to close the gap in the race. PlayStation had sold twice as many units as the Saturn in 1995, and this remained true through 1996. SEGA would attempt to entice people with a Christmas Saturn bundle that included Daytona USA, Virtua Cop, and Virtua Fighter 2, but especially after the release of the N64, Saturn sales would stay in decline. PlayStation's sales lead increased from a 2-to-1 ratio to a 3-to-1, and the release of Final Fantasy VII the following January could be seen as the death knell for the Saturn. While the two consoles had thus far been neck and neck in Japan, the breakout RPG caused PlayStation to well and truly pull ahead. SEGA would end this console generation with only a 12% share in the market, a far cry from the 60% they held during the Genesis days. By 1998, the Saturn would be officially discontinued, in stark contrast to its competitors, both of whom saw the release of some of their most well-regarded and influential titles that year. A handful of upcoming projects for the Saturn, such as Sonic Adventure and Virtua Fighter 3, would have their development moved to the Saturn's successor, as well as an ambitious Virtua Fighter RPG spin-off that was seen as the game that could possibly have saved the Saturn, which we would eventually get on the Dreamcast in the form of Shenmue. The Saturn did manage to keep a presence in the Japanese market, though, no doubt thanks to the popularity of arcade titles over there, as well as a truly hilarious marketing campaign revolving around the character Segata Sanshiro. And to its credit, Japanese sales of the Saturn did still manage to surpass those of the N64 in the end, by roughly 500,000 units. While Saturn was largely known for arcade games, and Saturn ports of PlayStation games were usually of mixed quality, the original titles the Saturn did receive were typically well regarded. Feedback to the console itself may be pretty mixed these days, but not many people seem to complain about its library. It still holds one of the greatest selections of shooters and fighting games in history, and Saturn continued the Genesis's legacy of possessing a wide variety of high-quality sports titles. Overall, though, the Sega of the mid-90s was seen as a bit out of touch with the demands of both the market and of the industry. If things like the Sega CD and the Sega 32X hadn't already soured consumers on Sega products, then the Saturn was definitely the final nail in the coffin for a lot of people. I don't think the Saturn was the cause of Sega's downfall. They had already been tripping up for years, and the Saturn was really just another symptom of that. Some could argue that the Saturn's decline was actually just emblematic of what was, at the time, a broader decline of the Japanese gaming industry in general. Japanese game companies had started to think that they were invincible as long as they just stuck to their little hierarchy, but more flexibility, more cooperation and participation with Western audiences could have saved them in the long run. Sega of America was also rather picky about which games they would choose to localize, particularly when it came to RPGs, and this ended up damaging the Saturn's reputation as a whole. A lot of the Saturn's most beloved titles, such as Sakura Wars, never left Japan, while others, such as Dead or Alive, Grandia, or Lunar, only saw North American releases via the PlayStation instead. Shining Force 3, which in Japan was released in 3 parts, only saw the first one make it stateside, and Panzer Dragoon Saga, which holds the highest average review rating of any game on the Saturn, saw fewer than 20,000 copies released in America. The convoluted nature of the Saturn's dual CPU hardware also means that the console is notoriously difficult to emulate, even today, and combined with the abundance of Japan-only releases, the Saturn has found a bit of a second life via the import and collector markets. Certain Saturn games have become true cult classics, with absolutely outrageous prices on the aftermarket due to both rarity and overall reputation making them highly sought after. Thus, the Saturn can be considered the console that caused the first real boom for import games in the West, meaning that, against all odds, Saturn was going to leave its mark on the industry in one way or another. Game review editor Matt Paprocki perhaps put it best when he said, quote, "The Saturn is a relic, but an important one, which represents the harshness of progress and what it can leave in its wake," unquote. The Saturn may be one of the most troubled consoles of all time, but through it all, it's also, somehow, one of the greatest.